The dust swirled in lazy, ghost-like spirals beneath the pounding hooves of the restless cattle, rising high into the scorching air and hanging there like a veil between the parched earth and the unforgiving August Sunday. It was the kind of heat that could drive a man mad. The year was 1883, and the Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction. A vast, empty ocean of grass, broken only by the occasional twisted mesquite tree or jagged, sun-bleached rock. This was cattle country, a land where fortunes could rise or crumble overnight depending on the season's whim. Out here, a man's worth wasn't measured in gold or silver, but in acres of land and the size of his herd. Jake Morrison swiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-streaked sleeve. His gray eyes squinted against the blinding glare as he rode his chestnut gelding along the fence line. He'd been in the saddle since before dawn, tracking every stretch of wire, searching for weak spots or breaks that could let cattle wander into someone else's land. It was grueling, thankless work, the kind that left your back screaming and your throat dry as dust. But it was honest labor, and around these parts, that was worth more than money. Jake was 28, and had the lean, rugged look of a man shaped by open skies and hard years. His hands were rough and calloused from endless hours of rope work. His skin carried the deep, permanent bronze of too many summers under the brutal Sunday, and his tired, gray eyes, they held a shadow, the kind of weariness born from countless nights on cold, hard ground, and days spent battling both beasts and weather. For nearly a decade, Jake had drifted like tumbleweed, ranch to ranch, always chasing work and never staying long enough to settle. The Hartley Ranch was just his latest stop, a sprawling empire of nearly 20,000 acres of prime grazing land. Old Samuel Hartley had carved it out of nothing over 30 relentless years, turning a small homestead into one of the most powerful cattle operations in the county. Jake had signed on only 2 months ago. Just another nameless cowboy among a dozen others. $40 a month, a bunk in the longhouse, and no questions asked that suited him just fine. By mid-morning, the sun blazed mercilessly overhead. That's when Jake spotted it, a broken strand of wire near a narrow creek bed. He swung down from his horse with practiced ease, grabbed his tools from the saddlebag, and got to work. His fingers moved fast, twisting and knotting the wire, focused on the job like he'd done 1,000 times before. So focused, in fact, that he didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were almost on top of him. "You missed breakfast again." The voice was soft, but carried an edge. Jake straightened, startled, and turned to see a young woman on horseback. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in one hand. Her simple blue cotton dress fluttered lightly in the breeze, practical, not fancy, and a wide-brimmed hat shaded her face. Even with the hat, Jake recognized her immediately. The delicate features, the stubborn set of her jaw. Samuel Hartley's daughter, Miss Hartley. Jake touched the brim of his hat politely and stood tall, dusting off his hands. "Didn't expect to see you out this far." Elizabeth Hartley Beth, as she preferred when her father wasn't around, swung down from her saddle with effortless grace. "Maria thought you might be hungry," she said, handing him the bundle. "She insisted I bring this out to you." As Jake took the parcel, the heavenly smell of fresh biscuits and crispy bacon hit him like a punch. His empty stomach growled in protest. He'd been up since 4 in the morning, running only on bitter black coffee. "That's mighty kind of her," he said, unwrapping the food with gratitude. His voice softened. "And kind of you to bring it." Beth's serious expression broke into a quick, dazzling smile. "Maria's convinced that you cowboys would waste away to nothing if she didn't mother you all," she teased. "And honestly, she's probably right." As she spoke, Jake found himself watching her closely. He'd seen Beth around the ranch plenty of times. Everyone had. She was impossible to miss, the boss's daughter always was. But up close, she seemed different. Her green eyes, so much like her father's, held warmth instead of Samuel Hartley's cold, calculating fire. A stray curl of auburn hair escaped from beneath her hat, brushing her sun-kissed skin. It glimmered in the harsh daylight, softening her strong features. "Your father know you're out here?" Jake asked, tearing into one of the biscuits. He wasn't trying to be nosy, but he knew Samuel Hartley's reputation. A hard, uncompromising man who ran his ranch with an iron fist and kept a tight leash on his only daughter. Beth's smile faded. her jaw tightening. "Father's in town on business," she said, a note of defiance slipping into her voice. "He won't be back until evening." She hesitated for just a second before adding, "Besides, I know how to handle myself. I've been riding these lands since I was 5 years old." Jake gave a small, knowing nod. "I don't doubt it," he said between bites of biscuit. The food was incredible, better than anything they served in the bunkhouse. "Still," he added carefully, "it might be best if you headed back. Wouldn't want you getting into trouble on my account." Beth's lips curved into a wry smile. "You're probably right," she admitted, but she didn't move. Instead, Beth wandered down to the edge of the creek. She stared at the slow-moving water, her reflection rippling beneath the bright Sunday. "It's peaceful out here," she murmured, her voice almost lost to the breeze. "Sometimes I feel like this is the only place where I can actually breathe." Jake studied her, silently. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the restless way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. He'd seen that same trapped look before on wild horses penned up too long, aching for freedom. "Yearning for open space?" Jake asked carefully, his voice low, testing the waters. "Ranch life not agreeing with you?" Beth turned slowly to face him. For a brief, unguarded moment, he saw something raw flicker across her expression, a mixture of frustration, longing, and defiance. But just as quickly, she smoothed it away, hiding behind the composed mask she'd clearly been forced to perfect over the years. "Let's just say," she said carefully, her tone laced with quiet bitterness, "that being Samuel Hartley's daughter comes with certain expectations." Jake gave a slow nod, understanding far more than she likely realized. He'd worked for powerful ranchers before and knew exactly how they thought. To men like Samuel Hartley, daughters weren't free spirits or independent souls. No. They were assets, bargaining chips to secure alliances, expand land holdings, and fortify fortunes. Marriages weren't about love, they were about strategy. It wasn't Jake's business, not really. But he couldn't help the stir of sympathy rising in his chest. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. "Well," he said finally, brushing crumbs from his hands as he finished the last buttery bite of biscuit, "I appreciate you riding all the way out here. Been a while since I had a meal that didn't taste like trail dust and sweat." Beth's lips curved into a genuine smile this time, softening her whole face. "You're welcome. Maybe I'll tell Maria she needs to check on you cowboys more often, make sure you're not all starving to death out here in the wilderness." The playful warmth in her voice was like a cool breeze cutting through the relentless Texas and heat. She moved back to her horse with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle, gathering the reins with fluid, practiced motions. But just as she prepared to mount, she paused, glancing back at Jake with a curious glint in her green eyes. "You're Jake Morrison, aren't you?" she asked. "From Colorado." Jake froze for half a beat, surprised she knew his name. "That's right," he said carefully, "though I haven't been back to Colorado in years." "The other men speak well of you," Beth said, tilting her head slightly. "They say you're one of the best horsemen they've ever seen." Jake felt a wave of heat rise to his face, and this time it had nothing to do with the blazing sun overhead. "They're being generous," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Just doing my job." Beth's smile widened, amused by his modesty. She swung smoothly into the saddle, skirts falling into place as she settled herself. From where he stood, Jake couldn't help but notice how the late afternoon sunlight caught in her green eyes, making them glow like precious emeralds. "Well, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a teasing lilt, "try not to work yourself to death out here. Maria would never forgive me if something happened to one of her boys." And with that, she nudged her horse forward. Jake stood there, silent, as she rode away. He watched until she disappeared beyond a distant rise, the rhythmic beat of her horse's hooves fading into nothingness. Only then did he glance down at the empty cloth bundle in his hands. He clenched it tightly for a moment before shaking his head at himself and returning to his work. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his thoughts kept drifting back to those green eyes and the way she'd said his name like it meant something more. The afternoon dragged on, the sun beating down with brutal, relentless force. Jake worked steadily, moving along the endless fence line, twisting wires, pounding posts, and repairing brakes. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the plains in streaks of orange and crimson, Jake was bone-tired, covered in dust, and ready to collapse. He swung into the saddle and began the long, weary ride back to the ranch. Thoughts of supper and the narrow cot waiting for him in the bunkhouse were the only things keeping him going. As the ranch buildings came into view, the familiar, comforting sounds of home reached his ears. The raucous laughter of men unwinding after a grueling day, the mouth-watering smell of stew and bread wafting from the cookhouse. Smoke curled lazily upward from the chimney, a promise of warmth and food. This was the life Jake knew, the only life he'd known for years. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. A hard, endless cycle forged in sweat and grit. But in that cycle, there was camaraderie. The other hands understood the harsh, unforgiving realities of frontier life. They didn't need to speak of it, it was etched into their faces, their scars, their calloused hands. For a fleeting moment, Jake felt at peace among them. Then, his gaze shifted upward, to the big house perched proudly on the hill. Lamplight glimmered faintly in the windows as dusk deepened, a warm golden glow spilling into the dark. Somewhere inside, Beth was likely preparing for her evening meal. Fine china, polished silver, crystal glasses, a world so far removed from the rough planks and battered tin plates of the bunkhouse. It felt like another planet. Jake's jaw tightened as he turned away, irritated with himself. What business did he have even thinking about her? He was nothing more than a drifter, a hired hand with no past worth speaking of, and no future worth hoping for. Everything he owned could fit in a saddlebag: his horse, his saddle, and the clothes on his back. Girls like Elizabeth Hartley? They were destined for better things. He told himself, to forget her, to bury the memory of her soft smile and the wistful way she'd talked about freedom, about breathing easily beneath this endless sky. But try as he might, she lingered in his mind like a stubborn thorn. As Jake unsaddled his weary horse and rubbed him down, the way she'd handed him the bundle of food, her fingers brushing his for the briefest instant, the longing in her voice when she'd spoken of wide-open spaces and escape. In this harsh land, even the smallest connection carried weight. A smile, a glance, a shared truth spoken beneath the burning Sunday. By the time Jake finally trudged toward the bunkhouse, the first stars were peeking out, glittering faintly in the vast, darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of labor, another day of battling the land, the weather, and the endless challenges that came with surviving on the Texas frontier. But tonight, he would carry the memory of green eyes and stolen words into his dreams. That night, as Jake lay on his narrow cot, surrounded by the rhythmic snores and restless shifting of the other cowboys, sleep refused to come. Instead, his mind kept replaying the same image: green eyes gleaming in the sunlight, auburn curls brushing a sun-kissed cheek. Would he see her again? The question haunted him like a ghost. September arrived with a slight break in the suffocating summer heat. The air carried a faint coolness at dawn, a whisper of the coming fall. The days grew shorter, but the relentless pace of life on the Hartley ranch never slowed. Jake slipped deeper into the rhythm of ranch work. Up before sunrise to tend the horses. Long hours in the saddle beneath an unforgiving sky. Collapsing into exhausted sleep when night finally fell. He'd earned the respect of the other hands, not through words but through tireless work and quiet competence. And though his life was still one of dust and sweat, there was a strange contentment in the familiar grind. Yet something had shifted deep inside him since that moment, by the creek. Now, every time he rode the pastures, he found himself unconsciously scanning the horizon, searching for a flash of blue cotton, or the distant rhythm of hoofbeats that might signal Beth Hartley's approach. Their paths crossed, occasionally brief encounters that left him wanting more. A quick greeting in the stables, a polite nod when she rode past the cattle pens. Nothing more than fragments of connection. And yet, those fragments lit a fire in him he couldn't ignore. It was on a cool evening in late September that fate finally stepped in. Jake had volunteered for night watch, preferring the solitude of the open land to the cramped, noisy quarters of the bunkhouse. He was checking on the horses in the main barn, lantern swinging gently in his hand, when the soft crunch of footsteps broke the silence. "Who's there?" Jake called sharply, his hand instinctively drifting toward his hip, even though he carried no gun. "It's just me." Beth's voice floated out of the darkness, calm but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. She stepped into the halo of lantern light, wrapped in a dark shawl that hugged her shoulders against the evening chill. Her hair glimmered like burnished copper beneath the dim glow. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Thought I'd check on Duchess. She seemed off her feet today." Jake's pulse quickened, though not from fear. "She's in the third stall," he said, nodding toward the far end of the barn. "I checked on her about an hour ago. She seemed fine then." Together, they walked to the stall where Duchess, a striking bay mare, stirred at Beth's approach. The horse nickered softly, stretching her head toward her mistress with obvious affection. Beth stroked the mare's sleek neck, whispering gentle words only the horse could hear. Jake hung back slightly, watching her with quiet admiration. There was nothing artificial about the way she handled the animal. It was pure, instinctive care. "She was my mother's horse," Beth said softly, her voice catching. "Or, she was, before." Her hand stilled on Duchess's mane. "Before she passed?" Jake asked gently. Beth gave a small nod, keeping her gaze fixed on the horse. 5 years ago," she murmured. "Father keeps saying we should sell her. Says she's getting old. Doesn't earn her keep anymore." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "But I can't bear to let her go." Jake's chest tightened. "There's nothing wrong with holding on to the things that matter," he said firmly. "Sometimes, they're all we've got." For the first time, Beth truly looked at him. Really looked, and in that moment, the barn seemed to shrink, the lantern's warm glow wrapping around them like a cocoon. The scent of hay and horses mixed with something unspoken, a pull between them, fragile and undeniable. "You must think I'm foolish," Beth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A spoiled rancher's daughter, fretting over one old horse while the world is filled with real problems." Jake shook his head, his gray eyes steady. "I don't think that at all," he said with quiet conviction. "I think you're someone who cares about what others overlook. There's nothing foolish about that. Not one bit." Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped, as if afraid to shatter the fragile moment. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching Duchess settle back into her hay. The only sounds were the soft rustle of straw and the occasional whicker of horses. Then Beth spoke again, her voice trembling. "Father's planning to marry me off." The words hit Jake like a kick to the gut. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, though his heart thundered in his chest. "That so?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Beth's shoulders squared, though her voice was tinged with bitterness. "Charles Whitman, from Dallas. He owns several banks and has business ties all across Texas. Father thinks it would be a perfect match, a profitable arrangement for both families." Jake swallowed hard. "And what do you think?" Beth's laugh was sharp, humorless, almost broken. "What I think doesn't matter, does it?" she said bitterly. "I'm 22 years old, practically a spinster by father's standards. I should be grateful a man like Charles Whitman is even interested." Jake's jaw tightened. "Should be and want to be are two very different things," he observed quietly. Beth turned to face him fully, and in the flickering lantern light, he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Have you ever felt trapped, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Like your whole life was decided for you before you even had the chance to live it?" Jake thought of his own past, the roads he'd traveled, the choices he'd made, the mistakes that had carved him into the man he'd become. "Can't say I have," he admitted after a pause. "Not in the way you mean. But I know what it feels like to live without choices. To feel like the world's already stacked against you. At least you can leave," Beth whispered, a trace of envy lacing her tone. "You can saddle your horse and ride off whenever you please. But me? Where would I go? What would I do?" Her voice broke as she added, "I can ride and shoot as well as any man, but none of that matters. Not when you're a woman." Without thinking, Jake reached out, His calloused hand brushed gently against her arm. "Hey now," he said softly, the words carrying more weight than he intended. "Don't sell yourself short. You're smart, capable. Anyone can see that." Jake's voice was rough but sincere. "Maybe things will work out differently than you think." Beth glanced down at his hand resting on her arm. The simple, fleeting touch sent a ripple of warmth through the cool night air. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what he was doing. He stepped back quickly, hands raised like a man caught doing something forbidden. "I'm sorry," he blurted. "I shouldn't have." "No," Beth interrupted, her voice quick, urgent. "Don't apologize. It's nice to have someone actually listen to me for once." She gave a shaky laugh, though her eyes shimmered with something deeper. "Father, just lectures." "And the ladies in town?" They whisper behind their fans, gossiping about me like I'm some sort of prize animal at auction. "But you," she swallowed hard, "you're the first person who's really heard me in a long time." Her words settled over Jake like a weight, stirring feelings he'd been fighting to bury. They stood close now, so close that Jake could see her breath mist faintly in the cool evening air. The lantern's glow painted her skin gold, casting soft shadows across her delicate features. The barn suddenly felt charged, filled with a mix of possibility and danger that sent a shiver racing down Jake's spine. "This barn's too big to feel empty," Jake said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. He gestured toward the vast, shadowy space above them. The rafters lost in darkness. All this space. Yet somehow, it doesn't feel lonely right now. He hesitated, heat creeping up his neck. "Unless you're here with me, I mean. Then, it's just big." Jake winced, instantly regretting his awkwardness. But Beth didn't laugh at him. Instead, her lips curved into a real smile, one that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face like sunrise breaking over the horizon. "Are you flirting with me, Jake Morrison?" "And," she teased, voice warm but edged with curiosity. "I know. I just meant," Jake stammered, completely flustered. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartley. That was inappropriate." "Beth," she corrected softly, her tone like velvet. "When we're alone, call me Beth." She stepped closer, so close that Jake caught the faint, sweet scent of lavender from her soap. "And I don't mind," she added, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "It's been a long time since anyone said something to me that wasn't about profit margins or proper behavior." Jake's heart pounded so violently. He was certain she must hear it echoing in the quiet barn. "Beth," he said, carefully testing the name on his tongue. It felt almost dangerous to speak it aloud. "This is dangerous territory we're walking into." "I know," she whispered back, her green eyes blazing. "But I'm so tired of being safe. So tired of doing only what's expected of me." Her breath trembled as she asked, "Aren't you tired of it too?" Before Jake could answer, the spell was shattered by rough, drunken voices approaching outside the barn. The sound of laughter and bootsteps crashed through the fragile intimacy like a thunderclap. Beth jerked back, panic flashing across her face. She clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "I should go," she breathed. "If they find me here." "Back door," Jake said quickly, pointing toward the tack room. "Slip through there. I'll handle whoever's coming." She nodded, hurrying toward the exit, but paused just as she reached the shadows. Turning back, her eyes locked with his one last time. "Jake," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for listening, for treating me like a person, not just Samuel Hartley's daughter." And then she was gone, vanishing into the night as silently as a ghost. Jake barely had time to steady himself before two ranch hands stumbled through the main barn doors, the smell of whiskey heavy on the air. "Morrison." Tom Brennan's voice was jovial but slurred. "What are you doing hiding out here? Thought you'd be out with the herd." "Just checking on the horses," Jake replied evenly, forcing his tone to remain calm. "What are you two doing back so early?" "Early?" Hank Sawyer let out a booming laugh. "Friend, it's past midnight. How long you been in here? Talking to them horses like they're your best pals." Jake blinked, startled to realize how much time had slipped away while he'd been with Beth. "Guess I lost track," he muttered. "Everything quiet in town?" "Quiet enough," Tom said, his tone casual, but his eyes gleamed with something that made Jake uneasy. Though there's talk about your boss bringing in some fancy fellow from Dallas. Gonna be a big to-do next month. Jake's pulse spiked, though his face stayed carefully blank. That so? He asked, his voice steady. Yep, Hank said, smirking. Seems Miss High and Mighty is finally getting herself hitched. About time, if you ask me. A girl her age ought to have a husband and a couple young'uns by now. Watch your tongue, Jake snapped before he could stop himself. His words were sharp, like the crack of a whip. Both men froze, eyebrows shooting up in surprise. Well, Hank drawled slowly, suspicion creeping into his tone. Don't tell me you've gone sweet on the boss's daughter, Morrison. That's a fool's game if ever there was one. I haven't gone sweet on anyone, Jake said quickly, his voice cold. I just don't think it's right to talk about a lady that way. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his drunken smile easy but his words edged with warning. Fair enough, he said. But take some advice from someone who's been around a while. Keep your eyes on your work and off the big house. Men like us, we're paid to work cattle, not to chase dreams above our station. After they finally left, stumbling toward the bunkhouse, Jake stood alone in the barn. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Tom was right. Of course he was right. Jake was nothing but a drifter, a hired hand with no past and no future. If Samuel Hartley ever caught wind of what had transpired tonight, of Beth's confession, of Jake's closeness to her, he'd see Jake run off this ranch. Or worse. And yet, as Jake walked out to check the herd, the image of Beth standing close to him in the lantern light clung to his thoughts like a brand. The warmth of her breath in the cool air, the softness of her voice when she'd said his name. He had been content once with this simple life, the steady rhythm of ranch work, the freedom of the open range, the comfort of knowing he had no ties, no burdens. But tonight, Jake Morrison's world had changed, and no matter how hard he tried, there was no going back. The fragile peace Jake had once known was gone, shattered, replaced by a yearning so fierce he didn't even have a name for it. Above him, the stars spun slowly across the endless black sky, cold and indifferent witnesses to the turmoil raging inside him. Somewhere in the big house on the hill, Beth was likely lying awake as well, staring at her ceiling and thinking of Charles Whitman, the man chosen for her. The cage around her life was slowly closing, bar by bar, and she was powerless to stop it. Jake's fists clenched as he stood alone among the softly lowing cattle, their voices like ghosts in the night. He wanted to help her, to give her the freedom she so desperately craved. But what could one man do against Samuel Hartley's iron will and the crushing weight of society's expectations? The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take his wages, saddle his horse, and disappear before things went any further. Yet every time Jake thought of Beth's smile, of the desperation and hope flickering in her green eyes, he knew the truth. He wouldn't be leaving. Not yet. Whether it was a trap for him, for her, or for them both, he didn't know. All he knew was that something had begun that night in the barn, something that could either save them both or destroy everything. Only time would reveal which fate awaited them. October arrived with cooler winds that whipped across the Texas plains, carrying the scent of autumn and change. But with that shift came a subtle, creeping tension on the Hartley ranch, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Word spread quickly among the ranch hands. Charles Whitman was coming. The whispers grew wilder each day, speculation running rampant in the bunkhouse. Jake kept his thoughts buried deep. But inside, each passing day felt heavier, pressing on his chest until it was almost hard to breathe. He and Beth managed only a few fleeting moments together since that night in the barn. A brief conversation while he mended a gate near the garden. A stolen glance when she rode past the cattle pens, her face unreadable beneath the brim of her hat. A hurried, whispered warning behind the smokehouse when she told him her father was in one of his dark moods. Each encounter left Jake more torn, drawn deeper into feelings he couldn't control and a situation that could destroy them both. On a gray afternoon in mid-October, Samuel Hartley called every hand to the main yard. Jake stood among the others, wiping sweat and dust from his brow as the rancher appeared on the wide front porch of the big house. Hartley's presence was commanding, his weathered face set in grim lines beneath his broad-brimmed hat. At 63, he was still a formidable man, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed, with piercing green eyes that missed nothing. It wasn't just his size that made him intimidating. It was the sense that the land itself had hardened him into something as unforgiving as the Texas Sunday men. Hartley began, his voice booming across the yard. "We'll be hosting important guests next week. Mr. Charles Whitman, his associates will be staying at this ranch." His gaze swept over the assembled cowboys like a hawk surveying prey. "I expect every single one of you to be on your best behavior. Any man who embarrasses this ranch will find himself looking for work elsewhere. Am I understood?" A low murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Jake's eyes, however, were drawn upward to a second-story window where Beth stood, pale and motionless, watching from behind the glass. For the briefest heartbeat, their eyes met, then she turned away, vanishing into the shadows of the house. "Morrison!" Hartley's sharp tone jolted Jake back to the present. "Yes, sir," he answered, stepping forward, feeling the weight of every other man's stare. Hartley studied him for a long, unsettling moment. "You've been doing good work here," he said finally. "Tom Brennan speaks highly of your handling of the horses." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied evenly. "I do my best." "See that you continue to do so," Hartley said, his voice smooth but edged like a knife. A subtle warning hung in the air. A man in your position would do well to remember his place. We run a respectable operation here. I will not tolerate any behavior that brings shame to this ranch or my family. His eyes locked on Jake's with a cold, measuring intensity. "Do I make myself clear?" Jake held the older man's gaze without flinching. "Perfectly clear, Mr. Hartley." "Good." With that, Hartley turned away, his booming voice once again addressing the men. "Back to work, all of you. We've got cattle to move before the weather turns." The crowd dispersed, boots crunching in the dirt. As they walked, Jake grabbed Tom Brennan's arm. "What was that about?" he demanded in a low voice. Tom glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Word of advice, friend. Whatever you think you're doing, stop it." Jake's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," Tom said, his tone grim. "Just remember this. There was a fellow here about 5 years back. Got a little too familiar with the missus before she passed." Jake's gut tightened. "What happened to him?" Tom's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Hartley had him horsewhipped and run clean out of the county, and that was just for innocent conversations." Tom's face darkened. "Imagine what he'd do to a man who so much as looked twice at his daughter." Jake swallowed hard but said nothing. The warning was crystal clear. That evening, Jake threw himself into the familiar rhythm of caring for the horses, trying to quiet his restless thoughts. The steady sounds of hooves, the earthy smell of hay and leather, they were a small comfort, a reminder of simpler things. Then he heard footsteps approaching. His heart leapt, certain it must be Beth coming to see him in secret. But when he turned, it wasn't Beth. It was Maria, the Hartleys' longtime cook. The elderly Mexican woman stood framed in the doorway, her lined face shadowed by worry. She glanced over her shoulder before stepping inside, her shawl drawn tight around her thin frame. "Mr. Jake," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years and secrets. Her dark eyes darted toward the house, then back to him. "There is something you must hear." And quickly. Maria's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she clutched the doorway, her eyes darting toward the house like a hunted animal. "Mr. Jake," she whispered urgently, "I have message for you." Jake set down the curry comb he'd been using, his brow furrowing. "From who?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Maria hesitated, then pulled a small, folded scrap of paper from deep inside her apron pocket. "You did not get this from me," she said fiercely, her voice barely audible. "I see nothing. I hear nothing." Before Jake could respond, she shoved the paper into his hand and hurried away, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow swallowed by night. Jake stared at the note, his pulse pounding. Under the dim glow of the lantern, he carefully unfolded it and his breath caught. Beth's neat, slanted handwriting leapt off the page. "The old oak tree by the creek. Midnight, please." I need to talk to you. B. For a long moment, Jake stood frozen, the paper fluttering slightly in his trembling hands. He knew what he should do. Burn the note, forget it existed, and keep his distance. But deep down, he already knew the truth. He'd be there at midnight. Nothing on earth could stop him. The hours crawled by like a slow, cruel torture. Jake went through the motions of supper, answering the other men's questions with a practiced, easy smile, all while his mind screamed with anticipation. When the bunkhouse finally quieted and the others drifted into slumber, Jake slipped outside into the moonlit night. The moon hung high and round, bathing the landscape in a ghostly silver glow. The shadows of the mesquite trees stretched long and eerie across the open plains as he rode toward the creek. Beth was already there when he arrived. She paced restlessly beneath the sprawling limbs of the old oak tree, her dark riding habit blending into the night. A flat-crowned hat sat low on her head, but tendrils of auburn hair had escaped, gleaming like molten copper in the moonlight. When she saw him, she rushed forward, then stopped abruptly, as though realizing how reckless even that small gesture might be. "You came," she breathed, her voice trembling with relief. "You knew I would," Jake said, his tone low, steady. "Though we're both fools for meeting like this." Beth wrapped her arms tightly around herself, even though the night wasn't particularly cold. "My father suspects something," she whispered miserably. "He's been watching me like a hawk, and Charles arrives in 3 days. Her voice cracked on the last 2 words, raw panic seeping through her carefully composed facade. Jake's jaw tightened. "Beth, you can't marry him. You don't love him." Beth let out a bitter, broken laugh. "Tell him that. He wouldn't hear me if I screamed it in his face. Mother tried once, tried to make him understand that she was suffocating here." Her gaze grew distant, lost in a painful memory. "He never listened to her, just like he doesn't listen to me." "What happened to your mother?" Jake asked softly. "If you don't mind me asking." For a long, heavy moment, Beth said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "She fell in love with someone else," Beth said. "A traveling merchant who passed through town." She shook her head fiercely. "Nothing improper happened, Mother would never. But Father found letters between them. Innocent words. Really. Just 2 lonely souls finding comfort." He didn't see it that way. Beth's hands clenched as she continued, her voice shaking. "He burned the letters, forbade her from ever going to town again. She became a prisoner in her own home." Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. 6 months later, she caught pneumonia. Sometimes I wonder if she just gave up fighting. Jake's chest ached at the grief etched in Beth's face. "Beth," he said quietly, aching to hold her but knowing he couldn't. "I'm so sorry." Beth drew in a ragged breath, the words spilling from her like a flood she couldn't stop. "The worst part? Father believes he was protecting her. He tells everyone she died because she was weak, fragile. But I know the truth." Her voice broke. "She died because her spirit was broken." "You're not your mother," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying conviction even he wasn't sure he felt. "You're stronger than that." "Am I?" Beth spun to face him, tears glistening on her cheeks like shattered glass. "Because right now, Jake, I feel like I'm drowning. Charles Whitman is everything Father wants," she said bitterly. "Wealthy, connected, respectable. He'll merge our ranch with his empire and build a dynasty." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling with disgust. "And I'll be the broodmare who makes it all possible." "Don't say that," Jake said sharply, anger lacing his tone. "Why not?" "It's the truth." Beth's voice rose, fierce and wounded. "Do you know what Charles said to me the last time he visited?" she demanded, her hands shaking. "He looked me over like I was livestock he was thinking of buying. He commented on my good breeding, my sturdy frame. Said I'd give him strong sons." Jake's hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles went white. "The bastard," he growled, barely keeping his voice low. "He's not cruel," Beth said tiredly, her anger collapsing into weariness. "Just practical. To him, marriage is a business deal, and I'm the commodity being traded." The creek bubbled softly nearby, the only sound between them as a heavy silence settled. Finally, Jake broke it. "What if you ran?" he asked, his voice hushed but urgent. "Left all of this behind?" Beth stared at him, startled. "And go where? With what money? Everything belongs to Father. Even if I managed to slip away, he'd hunt me down. His reach goes far beyond this county." "Then we'll go farther," Jake said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "California, Oregon Territory, hell, even Mexico if we have to." His gray eyes burned with determination. "Somewhere he can't follow. Somewhere you can finally breathe." Beth's breath caught. "We?" she repeated, almost disbelieving. Jake took a deep, shaky breath. "I know I've got no right to say this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just a drifter, a man with nothing to offer but hard work and a tough life." He met her gaze steadily, his heart laid bare. "But Beth, I care for you, more than I should." "If you want to run," Jake said, his voice breaking slightly, "I'll take you. I'll keep you safe." "Jake." Beth breathed his name like a prayer. She stepped closer, so near he could see the silver shimmer of her tears. "Do you mean that?" "Every word," he said without hesitation. "I know it wouldn't be easy. We'd be starting with nothing, building a life from scratch." He gestured toward the vast, moonlit ranch behind them. "You'd leave all of this behind. To whatever we could scrape together," Jake said quietly, his voice trembling with conviction. "But Beth, you'd be free." Beth reached up, her delicate fingers brushing against the rough stubble of his weathered cheek. Her touch was soft, reverent, like she was committing his face to memory. "Freedom with you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Sounds better than a prison made of gold." Jake caught her hand, holding it firmly against his face as if anchoring himself. "Think about what you're saying," he urged, his gray eyes burning with equal parts love and fear. "Once we leave, there's no coming back. Your father will disown you. You'll lose everything." Beth's expression hardened, her green eyes flashing with fiery determination. "I'd lose nothing that matters," she said fiercely. "What good is wealth if I can't breathe? What good is respectability if it costs me my soul?" Jake couldn't resist any longer. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. Beth came willingly, melting into his embrace as though she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. She buried her face against his chest, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Beneath the silent canopy of stars, they stood there knowing they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "When?" Beth asked at last, her voice muffled against his shirt. "After Whitman leaves," Jake said quickly, his mind already racing. "There'll be chaos during the visit. Once things settle, your father's guard will drop." He pulled back just enough to look into her face. "We'll need supplies. Money, if we can get it. I've got some saved, but it isn't much." Beth's lips curved into a determined smile. "I have Mother's jewelry. Father doesn't know I kept it." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's not much, but it might buy us a start somewhere." Jake searched her face, seeing the steel beneath her beauty. "Are you sure about this? Once we run, we'll be outlaws in your father's eyes. He'll send men after us. Then we'll keep running," Beth vowed, her voice low but unshakable. "Jake, I've been dying slowly for years. You're offering me a chance to truly live. How can I say no to that?" Emotions surged through him like wildfire, and before he could stop himself, Jake kissed her. Beneath the sprawling oak tree, with the moon as their silent witness, their first real kiss was desperate, tender, and tinged with the terrible knowledge of what they were risking. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, both knew they were lost to each other forever. "I should go," Beth said reluctantly, her fingers lingering on his chest. "If I'm discovered missing." "Go," Jake urged. "Be careful. Act normal. Don't give him any reason to suspect." "When will I see you again?" she whispered. "I'll find a way," he promised, his voice fierce. "Even if it's just a moment, we'll keep planning." Beth turned to leave, then paused. Her eyes glistened in the moonlight as she looked back at him. "Jake," she said softly, "that night in the barn, When you said it was too big to feel empty unless I was there. I understand, now. Her voice wavered as she finished. Every space feels empty without you in it. And then she was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a ghost. Jake stood alone beneath the towering oak, his lips still tingling from her kiss. His mind ablaze with plans and possibilities. There was no turning back now. As he carefully made his way back to the bunkhouse, reality crashed over him like a storm. Samuel Hartley was not a man to cross lightly. If their plan failed, if they were caught, the consequences would be catastrophic. But when Jake closed his eyes, he saw the desperation in Beth's face, felt the way she'd clung to him beneath the stars. For her freedom, he would risk everything. The die was cast. Now, all that remained was to see how fate would fall. The morning Charles Whitman arrived at the Hartley Ranch dawned sharp and cold, the kind of morning that promised winter's approach. Jake was in the training pen, working a restless bay gelding, when the convoy of carriages appeared on the horizon. Dust rose in thick clouds behind them as they thundered up the main drive. Forcing himself to focus on the horse beneath him, Jake kept his movements calm and steady. But his eyes betrayed him, drifting again and again toward the big house, where the day's drama was unfolding. Charles Whitman emerged from the lead carriage like a man stepping onto a stage. Tall, broad, and perfectly groomed, his prematurely silver hair gleamed in the sunlight. His tailored suit screamed of wealth and power, and he moved with the lazy confidence of someone used to getting whatever he wanted. Samuel Hartley greeted him with a crushing handshake, their laughter booming across the yard. And then Beth appeared. She descended the porch steps like a vision, dressed in a flowing green silk gown Jake had never seen before. Even at a distance, he could see the unnatural stiffness in her posture, the way her movements seemed rehearsed rather than free. Whitman took her hand, bowing slightly as he pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture should have been courtly. Instead, it felt like possession. Jake's jaw clenched so hard it ached, his blood roaring in his ears. "Easy there, Morrison." Tom Brennan's voice broke through his haze of fury. The older cowboy appeared at Jake's side, watching him carefully. "That horse can feel every ounce of tension in you," Tom warned. Jake forced himself to loosen his grip on the reins, exhaling slowly. "Just concentrating on the work," he muttered. "Sure you are," Tom said with a skeptical snort. "Word of advice, make yourself scarce these next few days." He cast a wary glance toward Whitman and his entourage. "Old man Hartley's on edge already. And Whitman brought some rough-looking types with him. He calls them private security. But to me, they look more like hired guns." Jake's gut tightened. That was all they needed, armed men watching Beth's every move. That evening, Jake was in the barn repairing tack, trying to calm his nerves, when the night erupted into chaos. Shouts split the air, sharp and urgent. Then came the unmistakable crack of gunfire, followed by the thunder of panicked hooves. The horses in the barn screamed and kicked, slamming against their stalls. Jake dropped his tools and sprinted to the doorway, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening outside, it had just blown their fragile world wide open. Jake didn't think he moved. He snatched a rifle from the wall, heart hammering, and burst through the barn doors into a scene of pure chaos. Masked riders thundered across the ranch yard, firing wildly into the night. Gunfire cracked like lightning, mingling with the terrified screams of horses and cattle scattering in every direction. The acrid smell of smoke burned Jake's nostrils as he spotted flames licking at the feed storage building. The ranch was under siege. Without hesitation, Jake sprinted toward the big house. If these men were raiders, they'd go for the family first. As he rounded the corner, his blood ran cold. Two masked men were forcing their way inside through a shattered window. Through the glass, Jake caught a glimpse of Beth backing away in terror, her father Samuel shoving her behind him with a protective, desperate gesture. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Jake crashed through the side door like a storm, the wooden frame splintering around him. He raised his rifle just as one of the raiders swung his gun toward Hartley. Jake fired first. The shot slammed into the man's shoulder, spinning him around with a scream of pain. The second raider turned to fire, but Jake was already moving. With a savage roar, he swung the rifle butt like a club, smashing it across the man's skull. The raider crumpled to the floor with a groan. "Get down," Jake bellowed, throwing himself between the family and the windows as fresh gunfire erupted outside. He scanned the parlor, chest heaving, adrenaline flooding his veins. "The safe!" Hartley gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "They were after the safe!" But Jake wasn't listening. His gaze locked on Beth. She was pale but unharmed, her eyes wide with terror and something else. Their gazes met for one electric second. Relief. Fear. Unspoken words. Charles Whitman burst into the room like a conquering hero, a pearl-handled pistol gleaming in his grip. "What's happening? Are you hurt, my dear?" he demanded, rushing to Beth's side. His hand closed possessively around her arm, claiming her in a single gesture that made Jake's stomach twist. "Morrison here stopped them," Hartley said grudgingly, still catching his breath. "Probably saved our lives." Whitman's eyes flicked toward Jake, assessing, calculating. The next hour was a blur of chaos and grief. 3 ranch hands were dead, including old Miguel, who'd worked the Hartley ranch faithfully for 15 years. Several others nursed gunshot wounds. The raiders had fled into the night with a handful of stolen horses and supplies. But thanks to Jake's quick action, they hadn't reached the safe that held Hartley's cash reserves. As the sun set in a haze of smoke and blood, the surviving men gathered the bodies and tended to the wounded. The ranch felt like a battlefield. Jake had barely finished helping secure the horses when a messenger summoned him to Hartley's study. Inside, Samuel Hartley sat behind his massive oak desk, his face shadowed and grim. Whitman stood beside him like a sentinel, his polished boots gleaming in the lamplight. "Sit down, Morrison," Hartley barked. "I prefer to stand, sir," Jake said evenly, his posture straight and unyielding. Hartley's eyes narrowed, but he let it pass. "You showed courage today. Quick thinking." His tone was reluctant, but there was no mistaking the truth in his words. "That's twice now you've proven your worth to this ranch." "Just doing my job, Mr. Hartley," Jake replied carefully. "No." Whitman's smooth, silken voice cut in. "You went above and beyond." He studied Jake like a hunter sizing up prey. "A man like you is wasted as a simple ranch hand." Whitman's smile was sharp, his words dripping with false charm. "I could use men of your caliber in my organization. Better pay, better opportunities. What do you say?" Jake met his gaze steadily, unflinching. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitman, but I'm content where I am." "Content?" Whitman repeated, his smile tightening, never reaching his cold gray eyes. "A man should aspire to more than contentment." He leaned closer, voice dropping into a silky purr. "Morrison, think about it. My offer stands." Jake didn't respond. His silence was answer enough. When he finally stepped out into the cool night, Beth was waiting. She emerged from the shadows near the bunkhouse and grabbed his arm, dragging him into the narrow space between 2 buildings where no one could see. "You could have been killed," she hissed, her voice fierce with emotion. "So could you," Jake shot back. His hands trembled from the rush of battle, though he kept his voice steady. Beth's grip tightened. "This changes everything, Jake. Father's suspicious of everyone now. He'll be watching constantly." She shuddered, fear flickering across her face. "And Charles," she couldn't even finish the sentence. "He's been asking questions about you, about all the men, but mostly about you." "Let him ask," Jake said firmly. "I've got nothing to hide. Don't you understand?" Beth's voice broke, rising in desperation. "He sees you as a threat. Not to us," she added, her eyes darting around nervously. "He couldn't imagine that, but to his authority." She swallowed hard. "You showed him up today, Jake. You proved yourself the better man. And Charles Whitman will not forget that." Before Jake could answer, the sound of boots crunching on gravel made them both freeze. Beth vanished back into the shadows just as Hank Sawyer's voice rang out. "Morrison? That you?" Jake stepped forward casually. "Yeah, it's me. Hartley wants all hands in the main yard," Hank said, slightly out of breath. "He's doubling the night watch." The following days passed under a cloud of fear and suspicion. The ranch was locked down like a military camp, with armed men patrolling every inch of the property. The atmosphere was tense, brittle. ready to snap at any moment. Jake caught only brief glimpses of Beth, always flanked by either her father or Whitman. The Dallas businessman seemed to have fastened himself to her side like a vulture guarding its claim. Each time Jake saw him touch Beth's arm or lean close to whisper, his blood boiled. The breaking point came one scorching afternoon as Jake mended a fence in the horse pasture. Tom Brennan approached, his expression wary, his eyes darting around as if afraid they were being overheard. "You hear the latest?" Tom asked, his voice low. Jake set down his tools. "About what?" "About who was really behind the raid," Tom said grimly. Jake's gut twisted. "What are you saying?" Tom scanned the horizon, making sure they were alone. "Couple of the boys went into town last night," he said quietly. "They heard things. Things you're not gonna like." Jake's jaw tightened. "Spit it out, Tom." Tom leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say the raid wasn't random. It wasn't bandits, Jake. It was staged." Tom's face was pale, his voice tight with unease as he leaned closer to Jake. "Heard some interesting talk last night," he murmured, glancing around to make sure no one was near. "Seems those raiders were too well informed. Knew exactly when the ranch would be vulnerable, like someone handed them a map." Jake's hands froze on the wire he'd been mending. "What are you saying, Tom?" His voice was a low, dangerous growl. Tom spat into the dust, his jaw tight. "I'm saying maybe someone wanted to play hero. Maybe someone wanted to prove that Samuel Hartley needed better protection. For his ranch. And his daughter." His eyes burned with meaning as he added, "Mighty convenient, don't you think? That Whitman's men were all mysteriously absent the night of the raid." The implications slammed into Jake like a sledgehammer. "You think Whitman arranged it?" Jake's voice was ragged with disbelief and fury. "I don't think anything," Tom said carefully, keeping his tone neutral. "But if I were you, I'd watch my back. A man who'd orchestrate something like that wouldn't hesitate to remove any complications." Jake's stomach turned to ice. 3 innocent men were dead. And for what? For a show to manipulate Hartley into trusting Whitman completely. That night, Jake lay awake in his bunk, staring into the darkness. His mind was a storm of rage and helplessness. If Whitman truly had engineered the raid, then he was a murderer, a cold, calculating predator who viewed human lives as pawns in a game of power. But Jake had no proof, only whispers and suspicion. And suspicion alone wouldn't save Beth. The next morning, the tension snapped. Jake was brushing down a gelding when raised voices echoed from the direction of the big house. He hurried to the stable window and peered out. On the porch, Samuel Hartley and Charles Whitman stood nose to nose, arguing fiercely. Beth hovered between them, pale and tense, her hands clenched at her sides. Suddenly, she broke free, skirts flying, and sprinted toward the stables. Jake ducked into an empty stall just in time. The stable doors burst open, and Beth stumbled inside, breathless and wild-eyed. "Beth," Jake said, stepping toward her carefully. "What's wrong? They've moved up the engagement," she gasped, clutching his arms. "Father wants to announce it tomorrow night. And Charles," her voice cracked, "Charles insists we marry within the month." Her green eyes were wide with panic. "Jake, I can't wait any longer. We have to leave. Tonight." Jake's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Tonight? Beth, we're not ready. We don't have enough supplies. I don't care." Beth's voice broke like glass. "I overheard them talking. Charles knows about us. Not everything, but he suspects." Her grip tightened on his shirt. "He told Father I've been too familiar with the help." Her face flushed with rage and humiliation. "After tomorrow night, I won't be able to leave the house without a chaperone. It will be too late." Jake pulled her into his arms, feeling the tremors that racked her body. "All right," he said, his voice a vow. "Tonight. Can you get to the oak tree?" "Yes," she whispered fiercely. "I'll find a way." "Bring only what you can carry," Jake urged. "We'll have to travel light and fast." Beth pulled back to search his face, her eyes shining with fear and hope. "You're sure, Jake? Once we run?" "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, steady and resolute. "I won't let them cage you, Beth. Not Whitman, not your father, no one, She kissed him then, quick, desperate, and tasting of tears. "Midnight," she breathed. "I'll be there." After she slipped away, Jake moved into action. He selected 2 of the strongest, fastest horses, ones that could outrun pursuit if needed. He packed his saddlebags with whatever supplies he could steal without raising suspicion. Dried beef, hardtack, ammunition, water skins, blankets. His hands were steady, but his heart thundered with every passing moment. This was real. They were doing this. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Jake took one last look at the ranch, the place where he'd come seeking nothing more than a job, and had found love, a love worth risking everything for. The die was cast. By dawn, he and Beth would either be free or dead. His hand brushed the gun at his hip, a grim reminder that Charles Whitman was already willing to spill blood to get what he wanted. Jake prayed he wouldn't have to pull the trigger tonight, but he was prepared if it came to that. The barn felt cavernous and lonely as he made his final checks. A bitter smile tugged at his lips. Soon, Beth would be by his side, and no place, no matter how large, would ever feel empty again, if they survived. Inside the grand parlor of the Hartley Ranch, a very different kind of war was being waged. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the assembled crowd. Ranchers and businessmen mingled, their wives whispering behind silk fans, their gowns rustling like dry leaves. Beth stood beside Charles Whitman, draped in an emerald green gown that made her skin glow like pale porcelain. Her smile was perfectly practiced, but her eyes were those of a woman on the edge of a precipice. Whitman's hand rested possessively on her elbow, staking his claim for all to see. Jake lingered near the servants' entrance, outwardly calm but ready to act at a moment's notice. He had volunteered for guard duty so he could keep Beth in sight while waiting for the moment to slip away. His saddlebags were already packed and hidden in the barn. 2 horses waited, tethered in the shadows, ready for a midnight flight. Just a few more hours, he told himself. A few more hours, and they would be free. Samuel Hartley raised his glass, his booming voice cutting through the din of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, pride radiating from every word, "I thank you all for joining us on this momentous occasion. Tonight, I am pleased to announce." Beth's hand twitched at her side, barely visible beneath her skirts. Her gaze darted toward Jake, a silent plea in her emerald eyes. Jake's muscles tensed. The world seemed to hold its breath. Their moment of reckoning had arrived. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel Hartley declared, his booming voice cutting through the hum of conversation, "it gives me great pleasure to announce the engagement of my daughter Elizabeth to Mr. Charles Whitman of Dallas." Polite applause rippled through the room, a shallow, hollow sound that made Jake's teeth grind. From his position near the servants' entrance, he saw Beth's fingers tighten around her champagne glass, her knuckles turning bone white. Her smile never wavered, but he could see the truth in her eyes. She was breaking inside. Whitman leaned down, whispering something in her ear. Beth flinched visibly, though she tried to hide it behind her rigid posture. Jake's hands curled into fists. It took everything he had not to storm across the room and tear Whitman's hand off her arm. Furthermore, Whitman's smooth, commanding voice carried easily over the crowd. "I am pleased to announce that the wedding will take place in 2 weeks' time." The crowd gasped, then clapped enthusiastically. Jake's stomach dropped. 2 weeks. Their window was gone. Their escape tonight wasn't just urgent anymore. It was life or death. As the evening stretched on, Jake's unease grew. Whitman's so-called security men were positioned like a net, stationed strategically at doors, hallways, and windows. They weren't watching the guests, they were watching the exits. Jake's instinct screamed a warning. Whitman knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to suspect Beth wasn't a willing bride. He caught Maria in the hallway as she passed with a tray of empty glasses. "Maria," Jake hissed urgently, "I need you to get a message to Miss Beth. Tell her." "I can tell her nothing," Maria interrupted, her face lined with fear. "Mr. Whitman, he has forbidden it. Any servant caught speaking privately to Miss Beth will be dismissed immediately." Her dark eyes shimmered with pity before she hurried away. Jake's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Whitman wasn't just suspicious, he was actively tightening the noose around Beth. And then, as if summoned by Jake's thoughts, Whitman appeared at the far end of the hall. Up close, Jake could see what others missed. The calculating coldness in the man's eyes, so utterly at odds with his charming smile. "Morrison," Whitman said smoothly, strolling toward him. "Taking a break from your duties?" "Just heading back outside, sir," Jake replied evenly, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Good, good." Whitman stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. "You know, my offer still stands. A man of your capabilities could go far in my employ." His tone darkened. "Of course, that would require absolute loyalty. The kind of loyalty that puts aside any personal feelings that might conflict with business." Jake's expression didn't waver. "I've always been loyal to those who treat me fair, Mr. Whitman." "Fair?" Whitman chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "Fairness is a luxury men like us can't afford." His smile sharpened into something dangerous. "Morrison, there are winners and losers in this world. The trick is making sure you're on the right side." He paused deliberately. "My bride-to-be seems distressed this evening. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Can't say that I would, sir," Jake said smoothly, masking his rage. "No," Whitman murmured, eyes narrowing. "I suppose you wouldn't." Whitman's pleasant tone returned, but his words cut like a blade. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Morrison. And do be careful out there. I'd hate for any accidents to befall one of Hartley's best men." The threat hung in the air like the stench of smoke. As Whitman walked away, Jake's mind burned with urgency. The escape plan wasn't just in danger, it was on the verge of being exposed. He had to warn Beth. Now. But there was no way to reach her. Whitman's men seemed to multiply as the party went on, tightening their watch over every hallway and door. Even Beth's movements were shadowed at every turn. An hour before midnight, Jake made his choice. He couldn't wait for the party to end. He would act alone. Slipping away from his post, Jake moved silently to the barn. His hidden gear was exactly where he'd stashed it. The horses nickered softly as he saddled them, sensing the tension radiating off him. He tightened the last strap, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. Then, footsteps. His hand flew to his gun. But when the barn door creaked open, it was only Tom Brennan standing in the doorway. "Going somewhere, Morrison?" Tom's voice was quiet, resigned. Jake straightened slowly. "Tom, save it." Tom raised a hand. "I'm not here to stop you," he said, his eyes softening. "Hell, if I were 20 years younger and didn't have this bum leg, I might be going with you." He glanced at the two saddled horses, his expression grim. "Taking someone along. It's not what you think," Jake said quickly. "It's exactly what I think," Tom interrupted. "And you're a damn fool for it." A flicker of a smile crossed his weathered face. "But maybe that's what it takes sometimes. A damn fool willing to risk everything." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Here," he said, tossing it to Jake. "It's not much, but it might help." Jake caught it, feeling the weight of coins inside. "Tom, I can't." "You can and you will," Tom said firmly. "Call it a wedding present, since I doubt I'll be invited to the real thing." His face darkened. "Whitman's men are watching all the roads. Whatever you're planning, you'd better have a damn good route figured out." "We'll manage," Jake said, his voice hard. Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm sure you will." "And Morrison." He hesitated, then added softly, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing right by her. That girl deserves better than being sold off like prized cattle." When Tom left, Jake finished his preparations with renewed urgency. He was tightening the cinch strap when a commotion exploded from the direction of the big house. Shouts. A woman's scream. The crash of breaking glass. Jake's blood ran cold. Beth. Abandoning all caution, he grabbed both reins and sprinted toward the house, leading the horses at a run. As he rounded the corner, the sight before him nearly blinded him with rage. Beth was struggling against two of Whitman's men on the porch. Her emerald evening gown was torn, her carefully pinned hair tumbling loose around her face. "Jake!" she screamed, fighting like a wildcat as one man tried to pin her arms. In that instant, Jake didn't think. He moved. His revolver cleared its holster in a blur. The first shot struck the nearest man squarely in the shoulder, sending him sprawling backward with a howl of pain. The second man spun to face him, drawing a knife, but Jake was already charging. He tackled the man hard, the two of them crashing through a porch, railing in a splinter of wood in fury. Beth staggered back, free for the moment, gasping for breath. Behind her, the doors to the grand parlor burst open. Samuel Hartley appeared, his face pale with shock, and right behind him, Charles Whitman emerged, his pearl-handled pistol gleaming like a serpent's fang. "Let me go!" Beth screamed, her voice raw with fury. "You have no right!" Her words sliced through the night air like a whip, but the men only laughed, holding her tighter. Jake didn't hesitate. His revolver cleared leather in a heartbeat. He fired a warning shot into the sky, the deafening crack echoing across the ranch. "Release her. Now." The two men turned to face him. Even through their rough bandanas, Jake recognized them two of the meanest, most vicious men from Whitman's crew. One of them smirked, a cruel, mocking smile. "Well, well," he drawled. "The hero shows up, just like Mr. Whitman said he might." Jake's voice was deadly calm. "I said, let her go." "Jake!" Beth cried, her voice sharp with panic. "It's a trap! They knew!" The smirking man's response was to backhand her, sending her sprawling to her knees with a cry of pain. And Jake saw red. His next shot wasn't a warning. The gun roared, and the man who had struck Beth staggered backward, clutching his bleeding shoulder before collapsing onto the porch with a howl. The second man lunged for his weapon, but Jake was already charging. In 3 strides, he crossed the distance and brought his revolver crashing down on the man's skull. The attacker dropped like a sack of grain, out cold. "Jake!" Beth flew into his arms, breathless and shaking. "They were waiting for me," she gasped. Charles knows everything. And Father." Her voice broke, anguish spilling out. "Father gave them permission to lock me in my room until the wedding." "Can you ride?" Jake asked urgently. "Yes." Beth's eyes blazed. "But we have to go now." There was no time to waste. Jake boosted her onto one of the horses, watching as she hiked up the tattered remains of her evening gown without hesitation. There was no room for modesty, not tonight. He swung onto his own mount just as more men spilled out of the house, weapons gleaming in the moonlight. "There." Whitman's cold, commanding voice sliced through the chaos. "Stop them." Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like lightning strikes. Jake jammed his spurs into his horse's flanks. "Ride, Beth." The two of them thundered down the ranch road, bullets whining past their ears like furious hornets. Behind them came shouts, curses, and the pounding of more horses as Whitman's men gave chase. They had covered nearly a mile when disaster struck. Beth's horse stumbled with a sharp cry of pain. Beth clung desperately to the saddle, managing to stay mounted, but Jake could see immediately the animal was favoring its front leg. "He's hurt!" Beth shouted, her voice ragged. Jake's mind raced. They couldn't outrun pursuit with a lame horse. "This way," he called. Veering sharply off the main road, he led them into a grove of cottonwoods, their dark silhouettes hiding a shallow creek beneath the trees. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind them, closer with every passing second. They dismounted, and Jake crouched to examine the horse's leg. "Not broken," he muttered, relief flashing across his face, "but badly strained. He won't carry you any farther." Beth's eyes were wide with terror. "What do we do?" "We ride double," Jake decided grimly. "Leave the injured horse here. It'll slow them down when they find it." Beth hesitated. "But they'll know." "Can't be helped," Jake said. He lifted her quickly into the saddle of his horse, then swung up behind her, wrapping one strong arm around her waist while gripping the reins with the other. "Hold on," he warned. Beth pressed back against him, trembling not just from fear, but from the icy creek water splashing around them as Jake urged the horse downstream. The freezing water soaked through their boots and clothing, but it would hide their tracks. Behind them, the pursuit drew nearer, and then began to fade as their trail vanished into the dark stream. Beth leaned into him, shivering violently. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything." "Nothing's ruined," Jake said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We're together, we're free. That's all that matters." His words were a lifeline in the darkness. They rode through the creek for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than one. Finally, Jake guided the horse up onto the far bank, breathing hard. In the distance, they could still hear faint shouts and see the flicker of torches. But the sounds were growing weaker. They'd shaken their pursuers for now. "Where will we go?" Beth asked, her voice trembling. "West first," Jake said, scanning the horizon. "Then north. I know some people in Colorado who might help us." He glanced back toward the ranch, his jaw tight. "But we have to put distance between us and your father's reach. He'll never stop looking." Beth's voice was quiet but resolute. "Neither will Charles. I've humiliated them. Both. Then we'll keep running," Jake vowed, tightening his arm protectively around her. "We'll keep running until they stop, or until we're so far away they can't find us." His voice hardened with determination. "I won't let them take you back, Beth. I promise you that." They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the exhausted horse and let him drink. As dawn broke, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold, they were miles from the Hartley ranch. Beth's evening dress had been torn to the knees, the ruined silk replaced by practical freedom of movement. Her once perfect hairstyle had been transformed into a simple braid, one Jake himself had helped her fashion during a stop in the pre-dawn darkness. "Look," Beth said suddenly, pointing ahead. Jake followed her gaze and saw a small homestead on the horizon. A modest sod house and a weather-beaten barn stood amid the rolling plains. Thin smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and possibly food. "Risky," Jake muttered, weighing their options. "Word travels fast out here. If anyone's heard about last night, they could turn us in." "We need supplies," Beth said firmly. She gestured at her tattered dress and bruised arms. "And I can't travel like this." Jake considered her words. She was right. They needed food, ammunition, and proper clothes for Beth. "All right," he decided, his voice low but resolute. "But let me do the talking." As they approached, the cabin door creaked open. A woman stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the rising Sunday. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a no-nonsense gaze that immediately assessed them. Her hand hovered near a shotgun propped against the doorframe. "Who's out there?" she called warily. "State your business." Jake tightened his grip on the reins, ready for anything. "We're travelers," he called back steadily. "Just passing through. We could use a bit of food and maybe some dry clothes." The woman's eyes narrowed as she studied them. Her gaze lingered on Beth's torn dress, her wild braid, and the bruises marring her pale skin. Something in her expression shifted from suspicion to concern. "Well," she said finally, voice still cautious. "Best, come inside. Then, you two look like you've been through hell." The woman was young, maybe 30, but her face bore the weathered lines of a frontier life, hardship etched into her skin like a map of survival. Her sharp eyes were wary, scanning every detail as her hand hovered close to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Morning, folks," she called out, her tone neutral but guarded. "You're out early." Jake tipped his hat respectfully. "Morning, ma'am. We've had some trouble on the road." His voice was calm, steady, but his hand rested near his holster. "Wondering if you might have some supplies to sell. We can pay fair." The woman's eyes swept over them, lingering on Beth's torn evening dress, the exhausted horse beneath them, and the way they sat pressed together on the saddle. Something in her gaze softened. "Trouble with family?" she asked quietly, almost knowingly. Jake hesitated, then gave a single, solemn nod. The truth behind his silence seemed to hang in the cold morning air. The woman sighed, her expression shifting to one of sympathy. "Come inside," she said at last. "I'll see what I can do." As they dismounted, Beth leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "Can we trust her, Jake?" Jake glanced at her, his eyes serious but warm. "We don't have much choice," he murmured. "But sometimes, folks surprise you." The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Sarah Garrett, a widow who had managed the small homestead alone for 2 years. Over a breakfast of warm biscuits and strong coffee, Sarah listened silently, as Jake and Beth shared a carefully edited version of their story. Beth spoke of escaping an arranged marriage, leaving out names and places. Jake spoke of danger on the road, but not of Charles Whitman's treachery. Sarah asked no questions. She simply nodded, her face full of quiet understanding. "I ran away once, myself," Sarah said finally, her voice distant with memory. "Didn't get far before my pa dragged me back." Her eyes misted briefly. "Married the man he chose for me after all." She smiled, sadly. "He died 2 years later in a barn-raising accident." Her voice grew steadier. "Been on my own since." She disappeared into a back room, then returned with a bundle of folded clothes. "These were mine when I was younger," she said softly, handing them to Beth. "Should fit you well enough, miss." Beth's eyes filled with tears, her throat tightening with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you." "Just be happy," Sarah replied simply. "That's thanks enough." An hour later, Beth emerged from the small back room transformed. Gone was the rancher's daughter draped in silk and jewels. In her place stood a frontier woman, dressed in a sturdy calico gown and practical boots, her auburn hair braided and pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. Jake's breath caught in his chest. She had never looked more beautiful or more free. Sarah sold them supplies at a fair price: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, and ammunition. When Jake tried to pay extra for her kindness, Sarah shook her head firmly. "Fair's fair," she said. "I don't need charity, and I won't take it." As they prepared to leave, Sarah's sharp gaze swept over them one last time. "Which way you headed?" she asked. "North," Jake answered vaguely. Sarah nodded. "Stay off the main roads for a few days. And if anyone comes asking," she gave a small, knowing smile, "I never saw you." They rode away with lighter hearts. Beth was properly mounted on, and a new mare, traded for their injured horse at Sarah's insistence. For the first time since their flight began, Jake felt a fragile spark of hope. Yes, they were fugitives, but they were together, and there were still good people left in the world. "Thank you," Beth said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet rhythm of hoofbeats. Jake glanced over. "For what?" "For keeping your promise. For coming for me." Her voice wavered, even when it meant ruining everything. Jake reached across the gap between them and took her hand, squeezing it briefly. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." They rode on, two small figures against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the frontier. Behind them lay comfort and security, bound in chains of expectation and control. Ahead lay hardship and danger, but also freedom and the open sky. And for the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt truly alive. 3 weeks later, 3 weeks into their flight, Jake and Beth had found a rhythm of survival. They traveled mostly at night, moving like ghosts across the plains. By day, they sheltered wherever they could, abandoned line shacks, caves, and dense groves of cottonwoods. Beth had adapted to the rugged life with a resilience that amazed even Jake. The once sheltered rancher's daughter now made campfires with practiced ease, tended their horses, and had even learned to handle a rifle with calm determination. The transformation stirred Jake's admiration and deepened his love for her. They were camped in a narrow box canyon in the Colorado foothills when Jake first saw the dust cloud. He'd been expecting it, watching for it every day, and still, the sight made his stomach drop. It was their past, riding hard to catch them. "How many?" Beth asked, her voice calm but tight as she followed his gaze. "Hard to say," Jake replied grimly. "Maybe a dozen riders, possibly more." His hands moved swiftly, packing their few belongings. "We need to move now." Beth didn't argue, but he saw the exhaustion etched in her face, the faint tremble of her shoulders. "The horses are wearing down," she said softly. "We're wearing down. Jake, we can't keep running forever." Jake froze, then cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "Just a little longer," he promised, his voice fierce with determination. "There's a town 2 days north, Redemption Creek. I've got a friend there who might help us." They rode hard through the night, pushing the horses to their limits. By morning, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. The pursuit had closed the gap. He could make out individual riders now, and at their head rode Bill Hackett, Whitman's brutal right-hand man, a killer with a reputation for speed and cruelty. "They're gaining," Beth said unnecessarily, her voice tight. Jake's mind raced. Fresh horses versus their exhausted mounts. They couldn't win a straight chase. It was only a matter of time before they were run down. He made a decision that went against every instinct to keep moving. "We're going to make a stand," he told her, his tone unyielding. Beth's eyes widened. "A stand? Jake, there are too many too. There's an old mining camp about a mile ahead," Jake interrupted. "I passed through it years back. Defensible ground. Narrow approach. We can hold them off there." Beth swallowed hard, fear and resolve mingling in her expression. "Jake, are you sure?" Jake met her gaze steadily. "It's our best chance, Beth. Our only chance. They want to take us alive," Jake said, crouched low as he checked the chamber of his rifle. "You, at least. That gives us a slight advantage." Beth's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She understood exactly what he meant. The abandoned mining camp clung to the hillside, like a skeleton of the past. Rotting wooden buildings, collapsed roofs, and rusted equipment scattered in the dust. It wasn't much, but it offered two things Jake desperately needed: cover and high ground. He placed Beth in the old assay office, its thick stone walls giving her the best protection. "You'll be safer here," he told her. "Just keep your head down and watch that trail." Jake himself took position in what had once been the general store. From there, he had a clear line of fire down the narrow approach path. They didn't have long to wait. The riders appeared just after noon, dark shapes emerging from the shimmering heat of the valley floor. Jake counted 14 men, every one of them armed to the teeth. Their faces hard and merciless, the kind of men who killed for wages. At their head rode Bill Hackett, Whitman's ruthless enforcer. His reputation as one of the fastest guns in Texas, well earned. Hackett's mocking voice rang out across the dusty ground. "Morrison! Miss Hartley, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." Jake's reply was sharp, unflinching. "Go to hell, Hackett." "Morrison, well now," Hackett called back, feigning hurt. "That ain't very Christian of you." His tone turned cold. "Mr. Whitman just wants his bride back. As for you, Morrison, your hide is negotiable. Send the girl out, and maybe we'll let you ride away." Jake's voice was deadly calm. "The lady stays with me, and we both know Whitman doesn't leave loose ends." A single rifle shot cracked through the air. Dust exploded near Hackett's horse, making the animal rear violently. Hackett cursed, yanking the reins to steady it. "Seems the lady's made her choice clear enough," Jake called, grim satisfaction in his voice. The attack came swiftly. Half of Hackett's men dismounted, advancing on foot while the others laid down covering fire. Bullets whined through the camp, smashing through rotten timbers and sending splinters flying. Jake picked his shots with deadly precision, his rifle barking thunder. 2 men fell before they reached cover. Beth was holding her own, just as Jake had taught her. Her shots kept the attackers from flanking their position, her face pale but resolute behind the sights of her rifle. The soft-handed rancher's daughter had become a fighter, Jake's equal in courage if not in skill, but they were vastly outnumbered, and their ammunition was finite. Time was not on their side. The firefight raged for over an hour. The old mining camp echoed with the roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of powder thick in the air. Jake's steady aim had cut down 3 more men, but a ricochet grazed his left arm, hot blood soaking his sleeve. Beth shouted his name, but Jake gritted his teeth and kept firing. He couldn't stop. Not now. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound rose above the chaos. A bugle call, clear and strong, echoed through the canyon walls. Jake froze for a heartbeat, his heart leaping as recognition struck. "The cavalry," he breathed. "They're here." Blue-coated soldiers of the 10th Cavalry swept into the camp like a storm, rifles blazing. Caught between 2 forces, Whitman's men faltered. Hackett shouted orders, but panic spread like wildfire. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others tried to flee and were cut down as they ran. A young officer dismounted near Jake's position, his face flushed from battle. "You, Morrison," he barked. Jake nodded, still catching his breath. "Yeah." "Lieutenant James Patterson, 10th Cavalry." The officer's voice carried both authority and urgency. "We got word there was trouble up this way. Seems someone named Tom Brennan figured you might need help." "Tom?" Jake felt a surge of gratitude for the grizzled old cowhand who had risked everything to save them. "The lady?" Jake asked, turning desperately. "Fine." Beth's voice rang out. She emerged from the assay office, her dress dusty and torn, her face smudged with powder smoke but unharmed. She flew into Jake's arms, clinging to him as he held her tight, ignoring the fiery pain in his wounded arm. Lieutenant Patterson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am. Sir. I'm afraid there's still the matter of the law." Jake's head snapped up. "What law?" "There are warrants out for both of you," Patterson said gravely. "Theft, kidnapping, assault." "Kidnapping!" Beth's voice rose in outrage. "I left of my own free will." "That's not what the papers say, ma'am," Patterson replied, his tone careful but firm. "According to the warrant, Mr. Morrison abducted you against your will and stole horses and supplies from the Hartley Ranch." Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but defiant. "Lieutenant, I'll come peacefully, but the lady will speak for herself." Beth shook her head fiercely. "No." She stepped forward, her voice ringing with conviction. "Lieutenant Patterson, I am not now, nor have I ever been a prisoner of this man. If anyone tried kidnapping, it was my father and Charles Whitman trying to force me into a marriage I did not want." The lieutenant's face tightened with discomfort. "That may be, ma'am, but I have my orders. You'll both need to come with us. You can tell your story to the judge in Redemption Creek." Jake nodded grimly. There was no other way. If they wanted true freedom, they'd have to fight for it in the courts now. As the prisoners were gathered, Jake's gaze fell on a familiar figure among the captured men. Hackett, alive, though nursing a bleeding shoulder wound. The gunman's eyes locked on Jake's, filled with venomous promise. A cold smile twisted his lips. "This ain't over, Morrison," he shouted. "Mr. Whitman's got a long reach, and a longer memory." "Shut your mouth, prisoner," Lieutenant Patterson barked. But Jake felt a chill snake down his spine despite the warm afternoon Sunday. He knew Hackett's words weren't an empty threat. The ride to Redemption Creek took 2 tense days. Jake and Beth weren't shackled. Patterson was a fair man, but armed troopers rode before and behind them, ensuring there was no escape. It was a strange reversal. To be escorted by the very law they'd been running from. Redemption Creek was bigger than Jake remembered. A bustling mining town filled with miners, shopkeepers, and drifters, its wooden streets echoing with the clatter of boots and wagon wheels. At the center stood the courthouse, modest but solid, a symbol of law and order on a lawless frontier. Jake's heart clenched as he spotted a familiar face waiting on the steps. Marcus Webb, his old friend, and the best lawyer in 3 counties. Marcus's sharp eyes scanned the approaching group, taking in Jake's injuries, Beth's disheveled state, and the soldiers escorting them. "Jake Morrison," he said with a mixture of surprise and concern. "When you sent for me, I didn't expect a cavalry escort." "Neither did we," Jake said dryly. "Marcus, we're in trouble. Big trouble." Marcus's gaze shifted to Beth, and understanding dawned. "Then let's get inside," he said. "You've got a hell of a story to tell, and not much time to tell it." "Jake, you damn fool." Marcus Webb's voice was a mix of relief, affection, and sheer exasperation as he clapped a hand on Jake's uninjured shoulder. "When I got Tom's telegram, I couldn't believe it. Stealing Samuel Hartley's daughter?" Jake's jaw tightened. "I didn't steal anyone," he growled. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I know that. You know that. But the law sees it differently." He turned to Beth, his expression softening. "Miss Hartley, I'll do everything in my power to help you both. But you need to understand your father's influence reaches far beyond Texas. This won't be easy." That evening, Jake and Beth were given guarded rooms at the local hotel while Marcus prepared their defense. The air between them was tense, heavy with unspoken fears. When Marcus returned, his face was grim. Charles Whitman is on his way here personally, he reported. Along with your father, Miss Hartley. They'll be here for the hearing day after tomorrow. Beth paled. Can they force me to go back? Marcus hesitated. You're of age, so legally. No. But. His voice dropped. Whitman's claiming you're not of sound mind. That Morrison here has influenced you somehow. Through mesmerism or some other nonsense. That's absurd, Beth exclaimed, her voice sharp with anger. Of course it is, Marcus agreed. But money talks, Beth, and Whitman has plenty of it. Jake stood abruptly and paced to the window, glaring down at the bustling street below. What if we made a deal? He asked. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What kind of deal? Jake turned, his face set in determination. I'll plead guilty to the theft charges. Take whatever punishment the judge hands down. In exchange, they drop all claims on Beth. Acknowledge she left of her own free will. No. Beth shot to her feet, her voice fierce and desperate. Jake, you can't. They'll send you to prison or hang you. Better me than you being dragged back to marry Whitman, Jake said quietly, his eyes locking with hers. Beth's hands trembled as she reached for him. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me, she said, her voice breaking. We're in this together, remember? Marcus cleared his throat. There might be another way. Jake and Beth both turned toward him, hope flickering in their eyes. Colorado law recognizes common law marriage, Marcus explained. If you two were legally married, it would be much harder for Whitman or Hartley to claim kidnapping or undue influence. The room went still. Jake and Beth stared at one another, the weight of his words sinking in. They had dreamed of marriage during their long flight, whispered about it under starry skies, but always as something for the future, when they were safe. Never like this under threat, with the law closing in. Is that what you want? Jake asked softly, his voice raw with emotion. Beth, I need to know. Beth's green eyes shimmered with tears. I've wanted it since the night you told me the barn was too big to feel empty without me, she whispered. But not like this. Not because we're forced to. Sometimes life doesn't give us perfect choices, Jake said gently. But Beth, law or no law, I want to marry you. I want to stand before God and everyone and claim you as my wife. The circumstances don't change what's in my heart. Beth's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then yes, she said, her voice trembling. Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Morrison. Marcus's serious demeanor softened into a smile. Good. I'll arrange it for tomorrow. The judge here is a fair man. He'll perform the ceremony himself. It might just complicate things enough to work in our favor. The wedding. The next morning, in the privacy of Judge Harold Crampton's chambers, Jake and Beth stood hand in hand. Marcus and Lieutenant Patterson served as witnesses, their faces solemn. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined. No flowers, no music, no family gathered to celebrate. But as Jake slipped his mother's ring onto Beth's finger, the only valuable thing he owned, he thought he had never seen a more beautiful bride. I now pronounce you man and wife, Judge Crampton declared, his voice steady but kind. And may God help you both, because you're going to need it when Sam Hartley gets here. The words sent a shiver through Beth's spine. But when Jake pulled her close, she felt a spark of courage. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That evening, the guards gave them privacy for their wedding night. Jake and Beth sat close in her hotel room, fingers intertwined, savoring their fleeting peace. Then came commotion from the street below. They rushed to the window, peering out. A procession of riders approached, torches blazing in the night. At their head rode Samuel Hartley, his face a thundercloud of rage. Beside him sat Charles Whitman, cold and dignified, like a viper ready to strike. They're here, Beth whispered, her voice trembling. Jake wrapped his arms around her. Let them come, he said fiercely. You're my wife now. They can't change that. Beth's lips quivered. You don't know my father or Charles. They don't accept defeat easily. Neither do I, Jake said, his voice like steel. And I've got something they'll never have. Something worth fighting for. As night fell over Redemption Creek, The newlyweds held each other close, knowing that tomorrow would bring the fight of their lives. Beth finally felt safe in Jake's arms, even as fear gnawed at her heart. Jake marveled at how far he'd come from a drifting cowhand to a man with a wife, a future, and a cause worth dying for. Judge Crampton's words echoed in his mind. May God help you both. Tomorrow, they would discover if divine intervention could stand against the combined wealth and power of Samuel Hartley and Charles Whitman. The hearing. The next morning, the courthouse was packed to bursting. Word had spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The wealthy Texas rancher versus his runaway daughter, and the cowhand who'd stolen her. Miners, townsfolk, and drifters crowded into the wooden building, eager to witness the drama unfold. The air was thick with whispers and speculation. Beth sat beside Jake at the defense table, her hand gripping his tightly. On the other side of the room, Samuel Hartley and Charles Whitman radiated fury and smug confidence. Whitman's sharp suit and cold smile made him look every inch the predator. Hartley's weathered face was red with rage, his green eyes blazing like a wildfire. Jake sat rigid beside Beth at the defense table, his hand locked with hers beneath the rough wood, as if they were holding each other against the world. Beth's grip was trembling, but her chin was lifted with quiet defiance. Across the aisle, Samuel Hartley sat ramrod straight, his face carved from granite, his piercing green eyes locked on his daughter like chains. Beside him, Charles Whitman radiated icy confidence, a viper coiled and ready to strike. Whitman's lawyer, Cornelius Shaw, stood like a general on the battlefield, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, his every movement calculated to intimidate. Beside him, Marcus Webb looked almost shabby in his worn suit, the underdog defending truth against power. Judge Crampton rapped his gavel. Order in the court. We are here to address multiple charges against Jake Morrison and Elizabeth Hart. He paused, correcting himself with a pointed glance at Beth. Elizabeth Morrison. Beth's shoulders straightened. She clung to the name like a shield. Mr. Shaw, the judge said, his voice echoing in the packed courthouse. You may present your case. Shaw rose smoothly, bowing his head slightly. Your Honor, he began, his voice dripping false civility. We intend to prove that Miss Hartley, Miss Morrison, as the defense calls her, was coerced, manipulated, and ultimately abducted by the defendant, Jake Morrison. He turned a shark-like smile toward Jake. Furthermore, we will demonstrate that this so-called marriage is invalid, performed under duress while Miss Hartley was not of sound mind. That's a lie. Beth shot to her feet, her face flushed with fury. Jake quickly pulled her back down. You'll have your chance to speak, he murmured. Don't let them rattle you. The judge's stern gaze fell on Beth. Mrs. Morrison, please control yourself. Beth bit her lip, but her eyes burned with righteous anger. Shaw's presentation was like a carefully woven noose. He painted Jake as a predator, a drifter who had wormed his way into a wealthy family's trust. According to Shaw, Jake had filled Beth's head with romantic fantasies, poisoned her mind against her father, and stolen her away in the dead of night. He spoke of violence and deceit, painting Beth as a fragile victim and Jake as a cunning manipulator. Every word dripped with calculated malice. We have witnesses, Shaw announced dramatically, turning to the crowded courtroom. Witnesses who will testify to Morrison's secret meetings with Miss Hartley, his suspicious behavior, and his violent actions when confronted. The crowd murmured, the tension crackling like lightning. The first witness was Bill Hackett, his arm still bound in a sling from the battle at the mining camp. Cleaned up and dressed in borrowed clothes, he almost looked respectable, as if he weren't one of the most feared hired guns in Texas. Mr. Morrison shot at us without provocation, Hackett declared, his voice steady and smooth. We were simply trying to rescue Miss Hartley, acting under her father's orders. Beth's nails dug into Jake's hand, her breath coming fast. Hackett's words twisted the truth into a dagger. Morrison had clearly addled her mind somehow. Hackett continued, shaking his head sadly. She even fired at us herself, which no lady in her right mind would do. Marcus rose for cross-examination, his tone deceptively mild. Mr. Hackett, how many men have you killed in your career as a security professional? Shaw shot to his feet. Objection. Irrelevant. Goes to the witness's character. Your Honor, Marcus countered. Judge Crampton nodded. Overruled. Answer the question. Hackett shifted in his seat, unease flickering in his eyes. I've defended myself when necessary, he said stiffly. Marcus stepped closer. How many? A tense pause. Maybe 7 or 8, Hackett muttered. A ripple of unease moved through the courtroom. And how much? Marcus asked softly. Was Charles Whitman paying you to retrieve Miss Hartley? Hackett swallowed. $500. A gasp rose from the crowd. It was more money than most men saw in a year. Marcus's voice dropped to a razor's edge. Dead or alive, Mr. Hackett? Hackett's silence was damning. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth was written plainly across his face. The next witness shocked everyone. Maria, the Hartley Ranch's longtime cook, shuffled forward with the help of one of Whitman's men. Beth gasped, tears springing to her eyes. Maria, she whispered. The elderly woman couldn't meet her gaze. Tell us about Miss Elizabeth's state of mind in the weeks before she disappeared, Shaw said gently, playing the role of compassionate interrogator. Maria wrung her hands. Miss Beth. She was troubled. Not herself. Spending too much time in the stables, neglecting her duties. Her papa was worried. Did you ever see her with the defendant? Shaw pressed. Maria hesitated. See. He was always watching her, following her. I warned her to be careful, but she wouldn't listen. Beth made a sound of pure betrayal, her shoulders trembling. Jake squeezed her hand hard, silently reminding her to stay strong. Maria had been like a second mother to her. Hearing her words twisted into lies was almost unbearable. Marcus rose for cross-examination, his eyes sharp. Maria, how long have you worked for the Hartley family? 20 years, she whispered. And in that time, Marcus asked softly, has Mr. Hartley ever threatened your position? Maria's face crumpled. I don't understand. Did Mr. Hartley tell you that you'd lose your job if you didn't testify today? Objection, Shaw barked. But Maria was already sobbing. Lo siento, Miss Beth, she cried. I have nowhere else to go. Beth's tears flowed freely now. But Marcus gave a single satisfied nod. The truth was out. The courtroom buzzed with angry whispers as Judge Crampton banged his gavel for silence. The final witness for the prosecution was Samuel Hartley himself. He strode to the stand like a general entering battle, his massive frame radiating authority and barely restrained rage. My daughter was raised properly, he declared, his voice booming. She knew her duty to her family, to her station. This man. He jabbed a finger toward Jake, eyes blazing. This man poisoned her against us. On cross-examination, Marcus's questions cut deep. What do you say to the claim that you were forcing your daughter into an unwanted marriage? Hartley's jaw clenched. I was securing her future. Charles Whitman is a respected businessman. He would have given her everything. Whether she wanted it or not? Marcus asked sharply. She didn't know what she wanted. Hartley snapped. She's a woman. They need guidance. Protection. Like your wife needed. The room went utterly still. Marcus's voice softened, slicing through the silence like a blade. Your wife died of a broken heart, didn't she, Mr. Hartley? Locked away because she dared to have feelings you didn't approve of. Hartley's face turned a dangerous shade of red. How dare you? Objection! Shaw shouted. Hearsay, prejudicial. Withdrawn, Marcus said calmly. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted deep. After a tense recess, it was time for the defense. Jake took the stand, his posture proud but unpretentious. He told his story plainly, without embellishment. How he'd come to work at the Hartley Ranch, how his feelings for Beth had grown, how she had begged him to help her escape a prison of expectations and control. I didn't kidnap her, Jake said firmly, his gray eyes steady. I helped her escape. There's a difference, Shaw pounced. You shot several men, Mr. Morrison. Jake's voice hardened. Men who were trying to drag her back against her will. And I'd do it again. So you admit to stealing horses and supplies? Shaw sneered. I took what we needed to survive, Jake said simply. I'll make restitution if the court requires it. Shaw's lip curled. And you expect this court to believe that a sheltered young lady like Miss Hartley suddenly decided to throw away everything for a saddle tramp like you? Jake's jaw tightened. His next words came like a shot. She didn't throw away anything, he said coldly. She chose freedom. Jake's voice rang steady and defiant, echoing through the packed room. I expect you to believe that Beth Mrs. Morrison is a grown woman who can make her own choices. And she chose me. But it wasn't Jake's words that turned the tide. It was Beth's testimony. She rose slowly, her simple calico dress a stark contrast to the silks she'd once worn. Gone was the pampered rancher's daughter. In her place stood a woman forged in hardship and fire. Beth walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, and the room fell utterly silent. My father means well, Beth began, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the courtroom. That opening shocked the crowd, and even Marcus, who blinked at her unexpected grace. He believes he was protecting me. But protection, her voice trembled, then strengthened. Protection became a prison. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the spectators until it landed on Charles Whitman. When Charles Whitman came to the ranch, I saw my future a lifetime of being owned, traded, from my father's control to my husband's. Never free to make my own choices. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle. And Mr. Morrison offered you an alternative. Beth's lips curved into a soft, trembling smile. Jake offered me hope, she said simply. He saw me as a person, not property. He risked everything to help me, when he could have just ridden away. Shaw pounced, his voice cutting like a whip. Your father claims you were manipulated. Not in your right mind. That this man, he stabbed a finger toward Jake, clouded your judgment. Beth's emerald eyes flashed like fire. My mind, she said fiercely, has never been clearer. Gasps filled the room. She held her head high, her voice gaining strength with every word. I chose to leave. I chose to marry Jake, and given the chance, I would choose him again, even knowing it meant giving up my inheritance, my place in society, everything. Mr. Shaw sputtered, but Beth silenced him with a raised hand. I've slept under the stars, gone hungry, been shot at, and worn the same dress for days, and I have been happier in these past weeks than in all my years in that big house. Her voice rang with raw truth. What good is money if you can't breathe? What good is position if it comes with chains? A strangled sound broke from Samuel Hartley. Beth turned to face her father fully, tears shining in her eyes. I love you, Father. I always will. But I am not Mother. I won't waste away waiting for a life that never comes. Jake makes me feel alive. He makes me feel free. Can't you understand that? For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Samuel Hartley's stern gaze. A crack in the armor. Pain, perhaps. Regret. Memory. But it vanished as quickly as it came. His face hardened to stone. You're no daughter of mine, he said coldly. Beth flinched as though struck, but her voice stayed firm. Then I suppose that settles the question of kidnapping. You can't steal what's already been thrown away. The gallery erupted with whispers, the sharp clap of the judge's gavel struggling to restore order. Closing arguments followed like twin storms. Shaw thundered about duty and deception, painting Jake as a fortune hunter, and Beth as a foolish young woman blinded by romantic delusions. He warned of chaos if the law sided with a drifter over a respected rancher and businessman. Marcus's voice, by contrast, was calm but powerful. He framed the story as one of love and liberty, two people fighting against injustice for the simple right to choose their own path. Not just for themselves, but for anyone who'd ever been silenced by power. Judge Crampton retired to deliberate. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, every spectator whispering speculation. Jake and Beth sat shoulder to shoulder, hands entwined. Their faces were pale but resolute. Whatever happens, Beth whispered, I regret nothing. Jake managed a small, crooked smile. Neither do I. Except maybe not stealing more horses. We could have used them. Despite everything. Beth laughed softly, a sound like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. An hour later, Judge Crampton returned. The room fell into a tense, breathless silence. "This court," he began, his voice steady, "has heard testimony regarding theft, kidnapping, and questions of competence. Let me address each in turn." He turned to Jake. "Mr. Morrison, the evidence clearly shows you took horses and supplies from the Hartley Ranch. For this, you are guilty of theft." Beth's grip on Jake's hand tightened. Jake's heart sank, but the judge raised a hand. "However," he continued, "given the circumstances that you were aiding someone in distress, and that you took only what was necessary for survival, this court sentences you to time served, and orders restitution of $100 to be paid to Mr. Hartley within 1 year." Relief surged through Jake. It would take nearly all his savings, but it was manageable. The judge's gaze shifted to Beth. As to the charge of kidnapping, the room held its breath. "This court finds no evidence that Mrs. Morrison was taken against her will. A woman of legal age has the right to leave her father's house, regardless of his wishes. The charge is dismissed." Beth sagged against Jake, sobbing quietly with relief. Judge Crampton's voice rose over the swelling murmur of the crowd. "Furthermore, this court recognizes the marriage between Jake Morrison and Elizabeth Morrison as legal and binding." He fixed Samuel Hartley and Charles Whitman with a hard stare. "Mr. Whitman, Mr. Hartley, you have no claim on this woman. She has made her choice, and the law supports it." The courtroom erupted. Charles Whitman shot to his feet, his face blotched with rage. "This is not over," he bellowed. "I'll appeal. You'll do nothing." A sharp voice cut in from the back. Lieutenant Patterson strode forward, flanked by armed soldiers. His expression was cold and authoritative. "Mr. Whitman," he declared, "I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of organizing the raid on the Hartley Ranch." Gasps tore through the room like thunder. "We have one of your men willing to testify in exchange for leniency." Whitman's mouth opened, then closed like a fish out of water. He tried to protest, but Patterson's men were already moving, their hands gripping his arms with iron strength. The mighty Charles Whitman was dragged away, cursing and snarling, his power crumbling before everyone's eyes. Samuel Hartley remained seated for a long, terrible moment. Then, slowly, he rose. For the first time, the proud rancher seemed old, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of his defeat. He turned to Beth, his expression unreadable. Beth's breath caught, hope flaring in her eyes. But her father said nothing. No apology. No blessing. He simply turned his back and walked out of the courthouse. The finality of it struck Beth harder than any curse. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling silently. Jake wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the courtroom buzzed with chaos. "It's over," he whispered. "We made it." Beth's green eyes met his, fierce and shining through her grief. "No, Jake," she said softly. "It's only just beginning." As they stepped out of the courthouse into the bright, unforgiving light of day, Jake felt the truth of her words. They were free. Now free to build a life together. But somewhere out there, enemies still lurked. Hackett's warning echoed in his mind. Mr. Whitman's got a long reach, and a longer memory. For now, though, Jake tightened his hold on Beth's hand. They had won this battle. And for the first time in their lives, the horizon stretched before them wide open and waiting. The 5 riders fanned out as they approached, their silhouettes framed by the rising Sunday. Dust curled around their horses' legs, a warning sign that trouble was riding straight for them. Jake's gut tightened. These weren't neighbors out for a friendly chat. "Beth," he called quietly, never taking his eyes off the riders. "Company coming." Beth stepped out of the half-built cabin, her rifle clutched firmly in her hands. 6 months of hard living had transformed her from the delicate woman she once was into something far stronger. Her calico dress was patched and faded, her skin bronzed by sun and wind. But her green eyes, the eyes that had first captured Jake's heart, burned with the same fierce determination. The lead rider reined in his horse and swung down with deliberate slowness. He was a thick-set man with weathered skin and sharp, calculating eyes. "Name's Carl Dugan," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "I own the biggest spread in this valley." His gaze swept over their little homestead, the rough-hewn cabin walls, the neatly turned garden, the stack of lumber waiting to be used. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And Jake felt a surge of protectiveness. "Dugan," Jake acknowledged, climbing down carefully from the roof beam. He kept his movements slow, his hands visible, though one stayed close to the holster at his hip. "Seems word travels fast around here." "That it does." Dugan spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, his expression unreadable. "Also heard you had some trouble down Texas way." Beth stiffened beside Jake, her rifle steady but her knuckles white. Dugan's lips twisted into a mockery of a smile. Something about stealing another man's woman. Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I didn't steal anyone," he said firmly. "This is my wife, Beth." Dugan tipped his hat toward her, though the gesture dripped with sarcasm. "Ma'am. Thing is," Dugan continued, his tone growing colder, "we've got a nice, peaceful valley here. We don't need no troublemakers bringing their past with them." "We're not looking for trouble," Beth said, her voice strong and unwavering. "All we want is to build a life. That's all." Dugan's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing about trouble," he said slowly. "Sometimes it comes looking for you." The words hung in the air like a threat. One of the other riders shifted uneasily, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Jake's fingers twitched near his own gun, ready but restrained. "Why don't you stop circling around it and tell me why you're really here?" Dugan's answer was a slow, deliberate smile. "Had a visitor last week," he said casually. "Well-dressed fellow. Fancy boots, city talk. Said he was from Texas." Jake's blood went cold, but he kept his face impassive. "Man, Ad was asking a lot of questions about newcomers," Dugan went on, his gaze sharp as a knife. "Particularly about a certain drifter and his pretty young wife who showed up not long ago. Offered good money for information." Beth's breath caught. She didn't need to hear a name to know who it was. "Charles Whitman," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage and fear. Dugan shrugged. "Didn't ask his name. Didn't care. Money spends the same no matter whose hand it comes from." Jake's voice was calm, but a deadly fire burned beneath the surface. "And, did you take his offer?" Dugan studied him for a long, tense moment. "Not yet," he said finally. "But a man like that don't ride halfway across the country for no reason." Beth stepped forward, her rifle unwavering. "If you're thinking of betraying us, Mr. Dugan, you'd better think twice. We've fought to get here. We won't be driven off now." The other men chuckled darkly, but there was unease in their laughter. Beth's stance wasn't for show, they could all see that. Jake placed a steadying hand on her arm, but his gaze stayed locked on Dugan. "We don't want conflict," he said evenly. "But if Whitman is hunting us, then trouble's coming whether we like it or not." Dugan's smirk widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Well, Morrison, that's what I figured. And I thought you ought to know trouble's already on its way." He swung back into the saddle with a fluid motion. "See, this valley's quiet now. But a storm's coming, and when it breaks," his eyes slid to Beth, "folks are gonna have to choose sides." The riders wheeled their horses and thundered away, leaving a trail of dust and dread in their wake. Beth exhaled shakily, lowering her rifle. "Jake, it's him. Whitman's found us." Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his jaw set like iron. "Let him come," he growled. "This time, I'm ready." Beth turned to him, fear and determination battling in her green eyes. "We built this together. I won't run again, Jake. Not ever." Jake kissed her forehead, pulling her close. "Neither will I. This land is ours, Beth. And if Whitman wants a fight," his voice dropped to a whisper, cold and certain, "we'll give him one."